In 1656, a black woman named Elizabeth Key walked out of a Virginia courtroom completely free because somebody misspelled a single word on a piece of paper decades earlier. That clerical error, scratched in ink by her own father, ripped a hole in colonial slavery law wide enough for her to walk through. But here's what makes this story stranger than any legal thriller you've ever heard. The typo wasn't an accident, and the man who found it was in love with her. This is the most important court case in colonial America that almost nobody talks about. Elizabeth Key came into this world around 1630 in the Virginia colony, and from her very first breath, she existed in a contradiction. Her father was Thomas Key, a white English planter, a man wealthy enough to sit in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature. Her mother was an unnamed enslaved black woman on his plantation. Thomas Key was, by every measure of colonial society, a man of standing. And Elizabeth was his daughter. He knew it. Everyone around him knew it. But knowing something and acting on it were two very different things in 17th century Virginia. Here's what you have to understand about this period. In the 1630s, Virginia's slavery laws were still a mess. They were improvised, inconsistent, and full of gaps. The colony hadn't yet built the rigid racial caste system that would define American slavery for the next 2 centuries. The legal line between indentured servitude and permanent enslavement was blurry. Some black people in Virginia were held as servants with fixed terms. Others were enslaved for life. And the rules about what happened to a child born to a free father and an enslaved mother, nobody had really nailed that down yet. Thomas Key, to his limited credit, didn't simply ignore his daughter. He acknowledged her. He had her baptized as a Christian, which mattered legally because there was a widely accepted principle at the time that baptized Christians could not be held as slaves. And then he arranged for Elizabeth to be placed under the guardianship of a man named Humphrey Higginson. The arrangement was supposed to function as an indenture, a fixed period of service, after which Elizabeth would be free. Thomas Key even brought this arrangement before the colonial court to make it official. The term was set. The paperwork was drawn up, and this is where the ink that would change everything first hit the page. Thomas Key died not long after making these arrangements, and with him died the only person who had both the authority and the motivation to enforce Elizabeth's path to freedom. She was a child, mixed race, motherless in any practical legal sense, and now fatherless. She was vulnerable, and colonial Virginia was not kind to vulnerable people. Humphrey Higginson, her appointed guardian, decided to leave the colony. But instead of making sure Elizabeth's indenture terms traveled with her intact, he transferred her, sold her essentially, to a man named Colonel John Mottram. And somewhere in that transfer, the terms of her service got quietly rewritten. What had been a fixed indenture, a countdown to freedom, became something murkier. The documents describing her status shifted, language changed. A word here, a classification there. Elizabeth Key, the acknowledged daughter of an English burgess, was now being treated as property for life. She spent the next 20 years in bondage. 20 years. She grew up, she worked, she endured. And the entire time, the paperwork that was supposed to protect her sat in colonial records, gathering dust, carrying errors and inconsistencies that nobody had any reason to examine. Until someone did. His name was William Grinstead. He was an English indentured servant himself, working off his own term of service on the same estate where Elizabeth was held. He was also, unusually for a servant, literate. More than literate, he had enough legal knowledge to function as an attorney in the informal courts of colonial Virginia. And he fell in love with Elizabeth Key. William Grinstead did something that no one had done in Elizabeth's entire life. He went looking for her paperwork. He dug through court records, transfer documents, and the original arrangements Thomas Key had made decades earlier. And what he found was a tangle of contradictions. The records didn't agree with each other. The terms of her service as described in one document didn't match the terms in another. Her status had been recorded differently at different times by different hands with different words. And then he found it, the detail that would crack everything open. In the original court records from when Thomas Key arranged Elizabeth's guardianship, there was a critical discrepancy. The language describing Elizabeth's status, whether she was a servant for a term of years or a slave for life, contained an error. The specific wording used to classify her didn't match the legal category that would justify holding her permanently. It was a clerical mistake, the kind of thing a court scribe might produce by writing too fast, or copying a document carelessly, or simply not understanding the legal weight of the distinction between two very similar words. A typo in the most consequential sense imaginable. Grinstead realized that this single inconsistency meant the legal foundation for Elizabeth's enslavement was flawed. The documents that were supposed to prove she was property actually proved no such thing, if you read them carefully enough. In 1655, William Grinstead filed suit on Elizabeth Key's behalf. The case rested on three arguments, each one radical for its time. First, Elizabeth's father was a free Englishman. Under English common law, the legal tradition Virginia was supposedly operating under, a child's status followed the father. This principle, called partus sequitur patrum, meant Elizabeth should have been born free. Second, Elizabeth had been baptized as a Christian, and enslaving Christians violated accepted legal norms. And third, the sharp edge of the blade, the documentary record was riddled with errors and contradictions that made any claim of permanent ownership legally indefensible. The case went before a local committee first, and Elizabeth won. The committee ruled she was free. But the estate of Colonel Mottram, who had died by this point, appealed. The case went to the Virginia General Assembly, the highest authority in the colony. And here's where the story takes its most infuriating turn. The General Assembly overturned the ruling. They sent the case back for further review, essentially telling Elizabeth that her freedom would have to wait. But Grinstead didn't stop. He pressed the case again. He hammered on the documentary evidence, on the clerical inconsistencies, on the gap between what the paperwork actually said and what Elizabeth's captors claimed it meant. He turned a typo into a legal weapon. And in 1656, the court ruled in Elizabeth Key's favor. She was free, the acknowledged daughter of Thomas Key, a baptized Christian. A woman whose enslavement had never been properly documented in the first place, because the people who wrote the papers got the words wrong. Elizabeth Key walked out of that courtroom. She married William Grinstead. They had children together. She lived the rest of her life as a free woman in colonial Virginia. But here's the part of this story that should keep you up at night. Elizabeth Key's victory terrified the Virginia colonial establishment, not because they cared about one woman's freedom, but because her case exposed how fragile the legal architecture of slavery actually was. If a single clerical error could unravel an enslavement, if English common law said children followed the father's status, if baptism could be a path to freedom, then the entire system was vulnerable, so Virginia changed the law. In 1662, just 6 years after Elizabeth's victory, the General Assembly passed a statute that reversed the English common law principle entirely. From that point forward, a child's status would follow the mother, not the father. The doctrine of partus sequitur ventrem. This one law meant that every child born to an enslaved woman would be enslaved, regardless of who the father was. It was a direct response to cases like Elizabeth Key's. It slammed the legal door shut behind her so that no one else could follow her through. They also eventually passed laws declaring that baptism did not change a person's legal status. One by one, every argument that had won Elizabeth her freedom was legislated out of existence. Her victory was real, but the system made sure it would never be repeated. Elizabeth Key won her freedom with a pen stroke that someone else got wrong. But her case set off a chain reaction that hardened American slavery into something far more brutal and far more permanent than what existed before. One woman's liberation became the catalyst for 200 years of tighter chains. Now here's something that haunts historians to this day. Elizabeth Key's mother, the enslaved woman who bore her, has no name in any surviving record. We don't know where she came from, how she ended up on Thomas Key's plantation, or what happened to her after Elizabeth was taken away. She is one of thousands of women erased from the documentary record of early America. I'm working on a video about the lost women of colonial Virginia, the ones the paperwork forgot. And if that's a story you want to hear, make sure you're subscribed so it finds you when it's ready.